To me, it's like a recreation of antique 80s nostalgia that never actually existed in the 80s, says Reddit user PickMear, in reference to the underground genre of music known as Vaporwave. Emerging at the start of the 2010s, the new and experimental music genre is one of the best embodiments of Jean Baudrillard's concepts of simulacrum and hyperreality. Through its use of nostalgia for times and places that either never existed or never existed for the listener, Vaporwave creates an artificial reality of distorted songs from past decades that somehow feels more real than the songs and the times that they came from themselves. Vaporwave has been described as music optimized for abandoned malls, a genre that is characterized by extensive sampling of earlier elevator music, such as smooth jazz, MOR, easy listening, and Muzak. Distorting and editing these samples, Vaporwave seeks to create a specific kind of effect, as Whelan and Nowak describe. The music seems to exhibit a kind of play with the use of established musical signifiers of irony, intimacy, artificiality, and distance. Warm atmospheres are applied to samples which are simultaneously looped in such a way as to draw attention to their artificiality. Incongruous juxtapositions, e.g. between synchronized loops of histrionic pop samples and old mass-market advertisements, are used to jarring effect. Samples are used to point in certain ways, where that pointing is often indeterminate or ambiguous. Perhaps the most significant effect of this style of editing and remixing is the way it brings about feelings of both nostalgia and emotional significance in songs that are intended to be shallow and commercial. Effectively, what Vaporwave attempts to capture and retransmit is the affective undertow of lived experience in the 1980s, producing in its listeners a sense and connection to that era, even if they have not personally lived in it. To explain what is meant by that, we must look at the first and most primary Vaporwave artist, Macintosh Plus, and perhaps the most influential of all Vaporwave songs, 420, from her album Floral Shop. Born in 1992, Macintosh Plus, or Vectroid as she typically refers to herself, was born after the decade that her music so effectively captures, and yet has spearheaded a movement centered on 80s nostalgia. Her music thus is a perfect example of a simulacrum, or as Baudrillard described it, a reproduction of something of which there is no original. The simulacrum is the center point of Baudrillard's conception of our contemporary reality as a simulation. The simulacrum is more than a mere representation of reality. Instead, it transcends the realm of representation and comes to be its own illusory world, totally independent of any objective reality. The development of the simulacrum occurs in phases, beginning as a reflection of basic reality, shifting towards something that perverts a basic reality, and then comes to mask the absence of a basic reality, before ultimately reaching the point where it bears no relation to any reality whatever. Applying this to the aforementioned song, we can see these stages expressed in both the level of the individual song, as well as the level of the movement which it spawned. Looking at the song itself, it is fundamentally built around the Diana Ross song Make Your Move. In this respect, then, it is a representation of the basic reality of the original song. On a base level, it is the same song with the same music and the same lyrics. However, this representation moves into the second of Baudrillard's stages as the various editing effects applied to it come to mask and pervert the original. Applying filters to make the kind of warmth and wear one might expect from a cassette tape or a VHS, Ross's voice is then pitched down to become ostensibly male, and the song is slowed down to assume an air of mediocrity. The lyrics, originally intended to represent the singer's desire, are chopped and repeated ad nauseum until they take on different meanings. Do you understand that's all in your hands becomes, do you understand that's all in your head? With these intentional uses of entendre and misunderstanding, the song moves into Baudrillard's third stage, as the misdirections created in the new song provide new depth to the lyrics, masking the shallow and uninspired lyrics of the original. From here, we can see that the song, taken as a whole, has fulfilled Baudrillard's final step, as the once generic pop song is rendered unrecognizably transformed into something entirely new. The new song is a somewhat droning, somewhat esoteric piece, where lyrics that once were used as expressions of affection and romantic frustration take shape as criticisms of capitalism and questioning one's own sanity. The bright Simpson feminine vocals are replaced through distortion and pitch shifts into a male voice crying out through slow, saturated, synthetic noise. This simulacrum created by the song also brings to light another of Baudrillard's concepts, that of hyperreality. The power of the simulacrum is that it becomes hyper-real, realer than real, an experience that carries with it more meaning and depth than the actual objective reality that has long since abandoned. In the case of this song, the aforementioned double entendres in the lyrics and distortions in the music create an entirely new sensation to the listener. The shallowness of the original song and the resultant fun but forgettable experience to the listener is replaced in the new song with a feeling of dread, emptiness, and questioning. While the original song is only satisfying in a superficial way, the new song is much more interesting and stimulating. insofar as it causes us to ask questions, to consider ourselves, and our relation to mass culture. But what does it make us want to think about? What is the central thesis of Vaporwave? To many, the answer is nostalgia. Nostalgia can be broken up into two different concepts. Personal nostalgia, a sentimental longing for a personally experienced and valued past, and vicarious nostalgia, nostalgia for a period outside of the individual's living memory. With Vaporwave, we see a movement rooted in vicarious nostalgia, as both the artist and the listeners were born after the 1980s. As a result of this, the movement takes the kind of personal nostalgia people who experienced the 1980s possess, and much like the Sans Vaporwave samples, distorts and modifies it into unrecognizability. One of the clearest examples of this is through the visual aspect of the genre. Here the genre takes color schemes, imagery, and layouts from 80s American and Japanese media and warps them into something different. By taking low-quality photos of beaches at sunset, early CGI, and other period motifs, and contrasting them with images of Greco-Roman statues and art, the movement takes 1980s nostalgia and uses it to create a sense in the viewer of a lost golden age. Much like how Renaissance artists would look to Rome, these artists look at the 80s as the last peak of a declining civilization. Yet even this analysis fails to take into account the irony of the nostalgia. Looking back at Baudrillard's stages of the simulacrum, we've already seen how Vaporwave moves from representation of the 80s to a perversion of it. However, Vaporwave truly reaches the level of simulacrum when the heavy anti-capitalist tones of the movement are considered. The 80s not only take on the form of a golden age, but also is an age obsessed with gold. The genre is focused not just on celebrating the 80s, but also condemning it. Utilizing the most bland, commercial, radio-friendly music of the 80s, Vaporwave tries to distort the music in order to show how distorted the era truly was, how dehumanizing commercial media can be. Thus, it also inhabits the third stage of Baudrillard's analysis, showing how this view of a past golden age masks the collective lack of meaning and value that the 80s represents. The simulacrum and hyperreality of Vaporwave as a movement finally comes into view when we consider the effect of the movement on the individual. Vaporwave intends to produce in us a sense of nostalgia. However, this nostalgia is not rooted in personal experience, such as past relationships or important moments in our lives. Vaporwave's nostalgia is the nostalgia for the mundane, a nostalgia for the most commercialized and commodified aspects of our lives. Vaporwave tasks us with thinking about why it is that we can get so nostalgic over elevator music, over places and ideas that we have never personally experienced, but only experience vicariously through the commercial media. Here, then, we see the nostalgic form that Vaporwave reproduces, fully stripped of the original reality it seeks to represent. The 1980s goes from a time being reminisced about, to one being criticized, to one whose non-existence is hidden, to one that is entirely non-existent from the conversation. Vaporwave turns the decade into little more than a thematic backdrop over which it provides its own meaning of capitalist critique. Consider then what this means for the listener who was not alive during the 1980s. The experience of the decade is lost on them. All that exists for the listener is the packaged up version of the 80s sold by advertisers and large corporations. To this listener, then, the 80s is a shallow and meaningless concept, disconnected from their own lives and experience. Yet through Vaporwave, this idea of the 80s is taken and morphed into an introspective look at how commercial interests interplay with our deepest and most personal emotions. The simulacrum of the 80s provides for the listener something realer than the reality of the 80s, something more meaningful and significant than the actual decade could ever be for them. Vaporwave is a fiction, an artificial narrative meant to comment on a more prevalent, but still fictional, narrative about a decade whose essence lies in a purely subjective experience. Through its use of distortion and editing, the genre turns hollow, meaningless songs into meaningful artistic expression. Through audio and visual cues, the genre turns the construct of a decade into a condemnation of capitalism. Throughout all this, however, Vaporwave itself relies on shared meanings, ideas, and concepts that have no bearing to whatever they originally meant to represent. Clearly, then, few artistic and music movements are more representative of and more aware of hyperreality and simulacrum than Vaporwave. Hey everyone, I just wanted to thank you for watching this video. This is my first video like this, so bear in mind that the quality will hopefully get better going forward. This is just like an old college paper I wrote that I just wanted to share with everyone. I'm really proud of it. And in the future I'm going to do some more stuff on all sorts of different topics, and it'll be like opinion and analysis, and maybe a little less academic. But I really hope that you appreciated this and it gave you a new look on what Vaporwave is and some of the interesting stuff about it. Anyway, that's going to be all for now. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a really wonderful day. Thank you. Have a good night.